Hello everyone. Welcome to another webinar promoted by SoftExpert. Today's event introduces the webinar Learning to See Using Visual Management and Process Confirmation. The webinar will be conducted by Damion Albinson, Senior Consultant at Process Management International. I wish you all a great webinar.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Welcome everyone to this week's webinar. I would say good afternoon, but some of you might be further afield than that. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So my name's Damion Albinson, Senior Consultant with PMI. I've been with the company now for 9 years, and I've been working in business improvement for the best part of the last 20 years. So this week I'm going to be talking about two subjects mainly: visual management and something called process confirmation. So I want to start off giving an overview of what those two things are, and then look at the purpose of why they're used, why they're applied, and then delve a little bit more into sort of some of the mindset that people need to use to enable them to be more successful using these techniques. And then lastly, we'll look at sharing thoughts on how you can sustain both of these techniques, even if you're now working in a virtual environment, as many of us find ourselves in the last 18 months to 2 years. So that's an overview of what we're going to touch on today. So a bit of context about these two subject areas, and this quote really nails it. Prevention is better than cure. I'm sure many of you have heard this mentioned before, and of course the idea is well, exactly that. I first came across this quote when I was actually in school learning about, I think the subject was medicine through time, and talking about the benefits of how the human race discovered that, of course, it's better to prevent disease than it is to try and cure it once it's there. So that idea obviously is still beneficial to us when we're in the context of running businesses and trying to improve businesses. And that really is the sort of bedrock on which visual management and process confirmation both sit. So the first subject area then is visual and audio management. So what is it firstly? Well, visual management is all around us in our everyday lives. It takes many different forms, whether it's digital, whether it be safety signage, whether it just be graphical or infographical information that's displayed to us in news articles, magazines, reports in the office, and so on. And it can obviously be visual or graphical, or it can be audible, as in things like alarms or signals and so on. And the idea of it is that it's trying to present to us the right information so we can make choices or decisions about how we proceed. So the classic one is, you're thinking of your car dashboard. It's presenting only the vital information that you need to be able to effectively and efficiently and safely operate a vehicle, and it's only alerting you to things when it really wants your attention. So if there's something very serious wrong, it might flash a light, it might actually make a sound, you've left the headlights on as you get out the door, or there's a low tire pressure warning, something like that. Anything that's more critical, it's really going to try and grab your attention. And so that's what visual management is. It's how do we think about alerting ourselves to what's critical in our processes, in order that we can then take this evasive action or change the course of action in terms of how we're operating the process. So I'm going to kick in with a poll. I always seem to do a poll pretty much up front these days. So this first one is: if you were to visit or view your process right now in this very moment, so instead of being on this webinar, if you were immediately kind of transported back into your process, how would you know the status of its performance? So we've got 5 choices here. The first one is it wouldn't be visually obvious, as in you'd probably need to go and ask a few people and say, hey, how's it going today? What are the problems? Answer 2 is it would be visually clear to you, but maybe not to a stranger. So that could be because you know what to look for. Just from your knowledge and experience, you might see something like a a high amount of work in queuing in a certain area that you would know would be unusual. But if a stranger were to see that, they wouldn't know whether that was typical or abnormal. Option 3 is some elements would be visually clear, but maybe not all of them. And then 4 is it would be immediately clear to both yourself and those who operate the process. And option 5 is just if you're not sure, you can answer this question. So we'll give you I think Susie's going to get that poll running for us, and we'll give you a moment to. Oh, it's already running. I can see the results coming in already.
Yeah, so I've launched that poll, so you should be able to see those options on your screen. It's a single choice poll, so just one answer. I'm also going to have a look on the live stream, and anyone who's joining us on the live stream, please do feel free to add in your comments as well. Okay. I think the last couple of moments, the last couple of people just to add in their thoughts, and then I will end that poll and share the results on the screen. Now, I know those of you who are on the live stream, you can't see this poll. Everyone who's with us on the Zoom today, you can see. So I'll just go through what we can see here. So 11% of the people say it wouldn't be obvious visually. In other words, they'd have to speak to other people to understand what's actually going on. Answer 2 has 22%. So it would be visually clear to them, but not to a stranger. Answer 3 has 56%. So that's the biggest selection, which is that some elements would be visually clear, but not all of them. 11%, it would be immediately clear to themselves and to the others who are operating the process. And the good news is everybody could answer.
Excellent. Fantastic. So yeah, so clearly answer 4 is where, you know, we would want it to be, okay, where it's not just to you who might be the supervisor, manager, leader of that area, but it's also obvious to the people operating the process. I'm going to touch on why that is as we go through the next few sections. And then, yeah, second to that, people say it's visually clear, but maybe not all of it. And that may be wise, in fact, which we're going to talk about as well in terms of, you know, which bits of the process do we really want to alert ourselves to? So, for instance, if we go back to driving a car, you know, would you really need to see on the dashboard something like, I don't know, what revolutions per minute that the axle is turning? You know, it's probably not going to be that much use, right? So we don't need to have metrics and visual management applied to absolutely every single corner of a process. That would just be overwhelming. So interesting. And then obviously for those that said it wouldn't be obvious visually at all, well then hopefully you benefit from this webinar and you can start to have a think about maybe you can apply some of this stuff. So great. Thank you for that.
Thanks everybody. I'll stop sharing that. Damion, if you want the answers later on to refer back to, just let me know.
All right, lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, right. So a mindset for visual management is on this model. So this is representing the hierarchical levels of an organization, from the big bosses at the top all the way down to the people who are doing or operating the process at the bottom of the pyramid. And the traditional mindset of management often relies on information to be passed up through the chain of command. So people discover maybe issues or problems or something isn't right in the daily work, but they have to then seek assistance or approval perhaps from the powers that be. And sometimes that might require it to go up a number of different levels before someone finally authorizes a decision. And then that action's then got to flow its way back down again to where it would be applied. So that obviously works, but it's not very responsive. In fact, it's actually quite slow. And some problems, issues, concerns really need dealing with, well, the sooner the better. So what visual management is trying to do, or a way to think about if you're going to apply it, is how do we make it more obvious to those doing the work, so enable the people at the lowest level to be more aware of the status of how the process is going, in that they can then take action themselves. and then alleviate the pressure that's often caused on the levels of management to maybe end up making decisions that actually could have been made much lower down. So that's one of the big benefits of visual management. If you are a manager or a leader, getting very frustrated sometimes that you're often getting dragged down into the weeds in the detail, setting up visual management correctly can be a way of alleviating a lot of those issues and problems that are always getting passed onto your over your desk. And the term it says in the bottom there, the gemba, is just a Japanese word that means it translates to something like the real place, as in where the actual work is done. So why do we use visual tools at all? I've mentioned a few points. The ultimate goal is to enable the daily effective and efficient and consistent process performance. And this is normally done by presenting information that helps us to understand performance to plan or performance to standard. So assuming we've got good standardization in place. And it helps us to, set priorities, understand, who's working on what, that kind of thing. But one of the main goals of visual management is this idea of, is the performance or is the condition normal or abnormal? So we're looking for these, what we refer to as abnormalities. And the idea behind that is that if we can identify something when it's in an abnormal condition, we can then start to investigate why that's there and explore ways in which we can eliminate that from happening in the future. So the idea is if we respond to abnormalities in the right way, we get greater consistency, we get more reliability from our process. So abnormalities aren't something to be feared, or certainly not something to be hidden away, which is where egos get in the way. We don't want the status sometimes to appear, problematic, to our superiors. That might seem like a, sort of a career suicide, but actually that if that's happening, that's the wrong mindset. We should, if we instead think about abnormalities as opportunities to make the process even better, then that's how we should think about them. We should almost celebrate abnormalities when they occur, because it suggests that if we've standardized our work, something still isn't right. There's still an opportunity there in that standard, in that process, in the way it's operated, that we can respond to in the right way to make it even better. So we can break visual management into three kind of core areas. There's elements of visual management that are signaling these abnormalities that I've talked about. So think of a fire alarm in a building. We can use other forms of visual management to help control the way the process is operated, and also to ensure that people comply with certain conditions or certain standards that we want to be adopted in the day-to-day. So signaling abnormalities, there's lots of different ways you could do this. For those that are familiar with control charts, and I think I've talked about those on one of the previous webinars, that's exactly what a control chart does. It tells us when we're studying or trying to understand variation, when is that variation what we refer to as kind of natural or expected, versus when have we got signals of variation that suggests something isn't right, something isn't normal, or it's not where we would normally expect it to be, and therefore we need to respond. But it could be things like traffic light signaling, red, amber, green sort of statuses. This picture here is obviously some sort of machine that's very visually telling us if it's running fine or if there's a problem, like it's jammed or it needs more material or something like that. And even for those of you these days, and it's probably most of us that have been through these supermarket self-checkout machines, you may have noticed that above each one of those tills, there is a what they call a lollipop stick, a red, amber, green status light that's alerting the support assistant to come over to you if that light goes red, suggesting that something's gone wrong with your checkout process. And so the support comes to where the support is needed. And if it's green, they leave you alone, or at least they're supposed to. So it could be control charts, it could be actual alarms, audible alarms. And this principle I've talked about of the help coming to the worker in Lean is known as andon. And some organizations even operate a stop call wait policy. So if there is a problem, especially a defect, they're willing to actually stop the process and get the support to come to where the problem is and try and fix it there and then, so that they never pass a defect on to their internal customers. That's just seen as a bit like putting your head in the sand. You know, it's trying to pretend the problem isn't really there, but it's going to have to be dealt with at some point. Then on to controlling the process operations. So thinking about ways we can visually do this. So it could be something as simple as a status versus plan. That's what's being displayed on that top picture there of a whiteboard. We introduced this with one of our clients who operated a large logistics operation in a warehouse, and they were shifting, you know, huge volumes of packages and goods that were being shipped out to various locations around the UK on a 24/7 rolling basis. And what we helped them to figure out is that if they work out what that demand is per 24 hour, and that varied a lot, they could then break that down to, well, therefore, how many units do they need to be processing per hour? And they put that on something nothing more complex than a whiteboard. And the policy was that every hour they could monitor, were they hitting that hourly target of units? And if they were, or they were slightly above, it was green. If they were under, it was red. And that meant that the moment they got a red, they could say, that's something's going wrong, and we need to resolve that now. Otherwise, when we get to midnight, which is the cutoff, we will have failed to have loaded all of these trucks that we're trying to send out around the country. Whereas in the past, they would usually have gotten to midnight before they realised that actually they're, you know, so many units behind, and now they can't recover. You know, that's too late now. They've failed the customer. It can be things like placement of where goods and items should be placed within things like warehouses, in factory floors, maybe even in offices. One really intuitive solution I saw once to control the stock levels is where people simply mounted like a board, piece of wood, I think it was nothing complex, behind where the items are usually stacked up, and the bottom of that board was painted red, and then above a certain height it was painted green. And again, the idea is that the amount of stock would vary depending on consumption, but so long as the people who operate the process could still see the green background, that suggested that the stock level was okay. But if they could see red, that was another flag of a problem, right? And then they had a set standardized process to follow on which to resolve that before it became a zero stock situation. And it can be things like specific charts to allow, you know, again, local process decision making, enabling the people doing the work to see where these abnormalities are and therefore respond. It looks like we have a question.
Well, I was just reflecting on your board example, Damion, and I was thinking about what some of the work that we've done with call centres, who often, you know, I mean, they've all got charts typically on overhead screens that are, you know, giving data about call wait times and how long calls are taking and so on. And those are great to your first point on the screen around capacity, because it allows them to say, we need more call handlers on. But one of the things that we found in that environment was that there were very few people who were working on the problem solving. So no one was looking at the root cause of why numbers were going up, you know, and these two have got to go hand in hand, haven't they? You want the visual management there, but you also want to know that somebody is going to, you know, for those more complicated situations, can do that root cause analysis, that problem solving, and make it better for future.
Absolutely, yeah. So if any of you have ever been fortunate to go into a call centre or maybe even work in one, it's very, very common to see them displaying certain visual metrics, usually, like you say, Sue, you know, on the ceiling or on screens really large, and it gives them stats on things like average call handling time, the average waiting time, the abandonment rates of people that are giving up and putting the phone down. And they can use those metrics in the moment to readjust things like allocation of resource to which process. Now, how many people we've got on the phones versus those who are just on email versus those who are maybe on web chat. Like you say, there's that follow-on part of, especially if we're routinely failing, then doing that kind of root cause part. And in fact, that's something I'm going to come on to talking about is this is more than just sticking some measures to a wall. It's actually about the system which surrounds that, which I've got coming up on a slide actually.
Oh, can't wait.
There you go. And then complying to standard, helping people to know what they should do to operate the process and ensure they follow certain standards. So of course you've got things like standard operating procedures. You might have mistake proofing visuals. So this picture on the right here is I think this was in Japan actually, a hospital. So they've painted the routings on the floor for different patient treatment routes. So if you're the porter that's moving patients around, between these different departments that are seeing you for different conditions, you follow the certain coloured routings, so you don't get lost and you keep that kind of flow work going. And then if any of you are familiar with 5S, the workspace organization technique, that's full of opportunity to use this idea of visual management to help comply to the standards that you create. So this picture down on the bottom left here is a classic sort of manufacturing solution you might see called a shadow board. So those tools there are, they've painted what they call the shadow. So if they are not returned, let's say by the end of the shift, it's visually obvious that something's missing. And they've no doubt identified that those specific tools are critical to the process operation. So if they're not returned by the end of the shift, then you've got an abnormality. And if that's not resolved before the next shift comes in or the following day, then that's going to be a knock-on problem, a knock-on effect. And if you're not working in manufacturing or hospitals, this could even be just something as simple as error proofing. You think of entering data into a web form or a website. You get these warnings flash up, or you're not allowed to proceed to the next page because you've not entered the right data into a certain field. That's, again, visual management. It's alerting you to the fact there's a problem, and it's not allowing that defect to be passed on further into the process. So some considerations, back to one of those points on that first poll, actually, what aspects of the process should be monitored? And there shouldn't necessarily be everything. So think about what are the aspects of the process that's most critical to the output that we're trying to generate. What's the process supposed to be creating, and what are the wants and needs of the customer around that output? That gives you then some indication about thinking of, okay, therefore, what are the critical elements that maybe we should make more visual, so we can keep an eye on those. And then what approach are we going to take? Are we going to do this with simple, things like whiteboards and pens and paper? Are we going to do this digitally, electronically? What's going to work best? And then how often should we monitor? So the example I gave with that warehouse, it was absolutely necessary for them to be monitoring on the hour, every hour. The team leaders will come together around that board every hour and take note of the status of the process. So other processes, that would be maybe overkill. You might just want to monitor something on a daily basis or even perhaps a weekly. And then who should be involved? Who should see these indicators and these metrics? And I've probably overdone the point now about the fact that it should really be down as close as you can get to the operators. And then how do you make it quick and easy and effective to do, and ensure that it becomes part of daily routines? So visual management shouldn't be seen as just this, these measures or these metrics or something that we've got to update after we've finished the work, and it's just kind of, seen as only a report for management. It should just be considered part of the daily work of everybody, because it actually helps us to run the process more effectively. So that's more of a mindset thing. So visual tools that can support management is often done using what we refer to in PMI as a huddle board or huddle review, where people come together collectively in what's usually a stand-up meeting, which is typically short in duration. This isn't like a normal 1 or 2 hour kind of management report review. This is designed to kind of get everybody on the same page at the same time. What are the critical bits of information that everybody should be aware of? And it's classically done at the start of a day. That could be done every day. It could be done a couple of times a week. Again, you can set these boards up. You can tailor them to the needs of the process. And the idea is that instead of having to walk around during the day as, let's say, a manager, and then constantly keep people up to date about what's going on and what the priorities are and what have we done with that issue we had last week, you get all of that done really, really quickly first thing in the day. I've just recently introduced visual management into one of my clients, and the process owner of this particular client has recognized just how much he calls it mithering, which I think is a bit of a northern term for, people bothering him constantly with questions and what's going on. And he says the amount of mithering I get now compared to before this is so much less. So it makes his working day more effective. He's getting less and less of these random interruptions from people who want to know what's happening with certain things, because they've all come together for what lasts for 5 minutes. And everyone's now briefed, and people know things like what the jobs are that are top priorities, who's working on what, the status of various things. A typical layout for these, in fact, it's coming up on the next slide. So back to my previous point about, this is not just about putting some measures on a wall or creating some, lovely charts or whatever. It's more of thinking about it as being a system. So if we've got our process, we've got some inputs to our process, we've got the activity itself, doing the work, and that generates the outputs, the thing the process generates. So we've clearly got to consider what data we might need to collect, to help enable this decision making. We then need to communicate this data to the right people at the right time, and also analyze it and make sense of what it's telling us. But essentially then that needs to lead into action. So if we're just displaying stuff on a wall and thinking that that's visual management, then we're fooling ourselves. It needs to drive action. And this is back to Suze's point about the call center, So the first question we're asking really is the information telling us that the condition we're seeing is normal, which means everything's okay, or abnormal? So if there is no abnormal condition, we just continue to monitor. But if there is an abnormal condition, then this starts to lead us now into our problem solving. So if we know what the cause was, then we can just make an adjustment and carry on. So that could be, we might know what's causing something. We're going to change how many people in the call center are on the phones. We're going to switch more people to email. We're going to make that adjustment and then continue to monitor. But if we don't know what's caused it, then we go down the problem solving route. And so we might need to take some sort of corrective action. So what can we do to put a sticking plaster on that? But then the really important part is, how do we then do the investigation part that drives us down to what we call the root cause of the problem? And that's when we start to consider how we can make the process better, how we can make it more robust, so that ideally that problem never comes back again. And that's the trade-off, I think, with problem solving. If you spend that time to do that investigation, the payback from that investment in time is that you don't get the repeat problem again in the future, which has brought you back that future time that you would have otherwise lost. And all too often, we go as far as doing the containment stuff, but we're too busy to do the investigations, and then we kind of just accept that problem will happen again and again and again and again. So it can be a bit like being trapped in a vicious circle. So the purpose of monitoring the performance is the point I've made on that previous slide. If we control the inputs to the process and the way in which the work is being done, or the activities, then we can best determine that we're going to generate quality outputs. And so if we're identifying the abnormalities in those inputs, or the way in which the work is done at the earliest opportunity, then we can lessen the impact of problems if and when they do occur, and we're doing the maximum we can to protect the customer. We can also help to maintain process standards. So when we've created process standards, we might need to do a degree of how do we know if those are working, how do we maintain those so that we don't regress back to how the process might have been prior to those standards being introduced. And the key thing with this, and I'm going to mention this probably again when I talk about process confirmation, is we should, again, seeing these abnormalities as opportunities to improve and to learn. If there's an abnormality and we didn't think that was possible because we've done some great standardization work, surely then that's an opportunity for us to reflect and learn something that we clearly didn't understand about our process. That's a great opportunity, rather than seeing that abnormality as something that shouldn't have happened and let's hide it away and don't let people see it. So yes, I think I'm probably almost certainly going to mention that again in the next section. So there's, as I said, you can tailor these huddle boards to whatever you want to suit your process. But we give this guidance that this is a typical layout of, or things to consider, I should say, for a visual management board. So you might have a section dedicated to people. That might track things like skills matrices, what skills and competencies does the team possess and how does that marry up with the needs of the process and how are people progressing and developing those. You could have things like attendance registers, who's off and on holiday, who's sick, who's going to cover that person while they're away. You then might have a section dedicated to the process. So for those that have been on other webinars or been trained by us, you'll understand what a SIPOC is. It's like a high-level summary of a process. You might have process maps or even SOPs against standard operating procedures. Then a section dedicated to plan. So is performance versus where we expect it to be, or are we deviating again, and therefore what we're doing about that? And then an area dedicated to just general performance. Performance could be on a whole range of different metrics and indicators. And then what you should always have, in my opinion, on a visual management board is then a section dedicated to improvement. Because if we don't have that, we might have some great metrics that enable us to respond to abnormalities and maybe, make decisions in the moment to resolve those. But how are we going to improve? What are we doing about it? What are we doing to actually move performance on? And that might include the small daily changes. That how do we tweak the SOPs to just, constantly refine them and make them better, versus the bigger change stuff, the big projecty type stuff that might be going off that may affect our area or maybe require us to support a project team that might be trying to fix parts of our process. So again, we can have all of that again on a team board and just keep everyone constantly updated with, what's going on, what's the progress and so on. And then if you were going to display that kind of information, this is maybe how you could lay it out, right? So you can see the different sections there that I've just been through. But again, you can tailor this to suit your needs, right? So you might have slightly more measures than that, less than that, and so on. But you've always got that improvement section there that's logging ideas and progress and what the results of experimentations were and that kind of good stuff. And then this picture here is an example of when we've set this kind of stuff up with our clients before. Now, we always recommend when we do this that you start off on brown paper. And of course, this was pre-pandemic days, of course, so you might actually be doing this virtually, in which case this doesn't matter so much. But we always say start off with brown paper because you'll almost certainly, within the first few weeks or months, decide that certain things are working, other parts aren't. And that's just PDSA, that's just learning, isn't it? You had a theory, we thought these metrics would help. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Let's tweak it, let's change it. Let's iron out the creases of this actual system until we feel like it's adding maximum value before we go having very expensive, professionally made graphical boards designed and shipped in. Because once you've got those things, you're stuck with those layouts. So our advice would be always start on brown paper first. It's a lot cheaper. It looks like we have another question from the audience.
Well, and again, it's about the performance boards versus the physical performance boards versus the virtual, really, Damion.
Oh, okay.
And I know, obviously in the work that we do, we use tools like SharePoint, we use tools like Miro, which enable real-time collaboration and can have the effect of a performance board like this. And therefore people, have the opportunity, don't they, to create these charts, to create these different areas on anything from an Excel spreadsheet through to a PowerPoint file, through to a Miro board. And all of this can be just like you used to do it physically in a room.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, actually, the technology that's really kind of come on in the last in 18 months has really enabled us to seriously consider doing that and doing it very well. Whereas historically, that was actually quite challenging. I've met many managers that really struggle with, how can I, they say, I'd love to do this, but I've got my teams located in several locations around the world, So how do we do it? And I think that the virtual technology we now have at our disposal these days actually now makes this just as doable now as it was when it was all physical. And in fact, we've had to do that in our own company, haven't we? If you think about PMI, we've
absolutely.
We had I don't think I put a picture of that in this webinar, but we had a huddle process in the Meriden office where the team would come together, the operations team would come together, and we had to transfer to doing that remotely because, as we all know, we weren't allowed to come to the office anymore. So, but we didn't let that get in the way, and neither should you. So absolutely, Suze. Yeah, this can be done just as effectively working remotely as it can do physically in person. Yeah.
And actually, in many ways, the other thing it does is I'm not saying forces a team to get together, but it does give them that regular imperative to do so and to ensure they do meet a team. They do talk about what's going on.
Absolutely. Which is back to the whole point of why you would want to do it, right? So that everybody knows what's going on. They know the status, rather than people just coming into work, doing the work, going home or staying at home, and being completely unaware as to whether, as a company or as a process, are we on fire or are we having a really great day? You want people to be aware of that because it might change their decision making as to how they're approaching their part of the work or their contribution to the work. So yeah, again, it's back to that, keeping people informed so that they can change the decision making and respond to the status at any given time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Damion.
No problem. So some hints and tips about using visual management. So I'll just quickly whiz through these. So charts and graphs are better than just static numbers. So I was working with some teams that a while back where they just had a single number. I think it was for like the total sales per day or something like that. So it was great that they were displaying something, but at the end of each day, they'd rub that number out and the following day, there'd be a new number there. And the problem with that sort of displaying of information is there's no sense of progress over time. So how did that team know if they were getting better or getting worse? What was this like compared to the previous month? They were losing all of that. So using charts, particularly charts that display data over time, is much better, particularly when we're considering improvement. And then making sure that people who are being briefed, especially when using charts and graphs, that they understand what they're looking at. They can understand the interpretation, even something as basic as, which direction is good, up or down, depending on what you're measuring. And then we need to make sure that we're capturing things like actions. We've got records of those. People are clear as to when they should escalate something. So usually if you've got these reviews through a whole hierarchy of teams, you can define, at what point should someone ask for support from the next level above, and be really crystal clear about defining those so that, again, you don't get everything being escalated, but you control the decision making. And also things like who owns the data, who's going to keep this stuff up to date, and so on. And then if you're working remotely, like we've just been talking about, then you could just have a recurring session, a recurring meeting, and make use of things like video, SharePoint sites, OneDrives or so on. Some great tools these days where you can have multiple people in the same file, adding inputs and so on. And it's all as opposed to how it used to be where you had to ping pong all of these email attachments to each other. And then the last point there, keep yourself off mute. So if you're running these, what we call huddles, it's a dialogue. It's not just the more senior person translating information one way. It's an actual dialogue about, you know, how are we working? What are we doing? Are we working on the right things? Who's going to take away these various different things to look at? And some opportunities then with regards to visual management. So you can improve how effective this whole monitoring system is by making sure that you know, we're using accurate data and it's reliable. It's data that's going to provide, as it says, meaningful insights. You know, rather than just tracking something for the sake of tracking something. It's all too easy to get carried away with measures and metrics. Making sure that data is collected, which might be to define who's going to collect it and when, and that it's done on time. Particularly with a huddle review, you don't want to be looking at yesterday's news. It needs to be topical and live and up to date. And that's down to the second point. We don't want to delay feedback or analysis because it might delay our response to what we're then seeing. So it's no use looking at a chart that tells us we had a problem last week. It's happened now, and it's probably affected the customer, right? So we want to spot things as early as possible. And then never use measures to punish or reward. I mean, this is I think I said this last time, this in itself could be a webinar because there's a lot of psychology and discussion we could have around this. So I'm not going to go into it just now. But the common mistakes people make is where they don't consider this to be part of the actual process of how they run their business. It's seen as an add-on or something only to satisfy you know, other people, rather than seeing it as an actual mechanism that can help them and their employees to run the process more effectively and more efficiently. You know, visual management is a technique, it's a tool that enables you to do that more effectively. And so therefore, if you're going to use this or improve it, then make sure it's fully integrated into just the daily work of everybody. There's nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with having operators who collect data, maybe go and update certain measures on a board, as well as managers that update other parts. You know, design it to work based on the people and the resources you have available. So that's visual management. The other technique I want to move on to is something called process confirmation, which often is part of visual management, or it can be, I often introduce it as part of visual management. And so before we go into any more detail on process confirmation, I'll have another poll. So the question this time is, why might it be useful to perform regular confirmations of processes? And for this one, you can select all that you think apply. So the first answer says, to ensure we're adhering to legislation or regulatory requirements. Or do you think it's to check up on operators and catch them in the act of doing things they maybe shouldn't be doing? Maintain a presence of management in the workplace? Or is it to validate that that what we believe is supposed to happen happens? Or so we prepared for sort of audits, internal or external third-party audits? Or option 6, you might just say, I don't know. Not too sure. So Suzanne's going to get that poll running. I can see it's just started, so we'll give you a few moments to.
So that's launched, and as Damion says, that's a multiple choice. So feel free, if there are 2 or 3 things on here that apply to you, select all of them. Don't feel limited. Not like last time. That's great. And again, on the live streams, please do add your thoughts into the chat, and I will respond to them through the chat as well. So please do join in.
And what would be interesting, actually, if anyone wants to comment, is what sorts of things do people, if you're doing confirmations already, what sort of things are you confirming in your businesses? That would be great. In the chat. Yeah, if you want to drop a few comments about that, that'd be quite interesting.
Okay, I've got so Velda has popped into the chat that they're working in a regulated industry related to security, and so they have to do all of these as part of their regulations. So that's great to know. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you everyone for your contributions. And I'm sharing the results on the screen. So for those of you who can't see this, who's on our live streams, the first question to ensure we're adhering to regulatory or requirements or to legislation, 50%. To check up on operators and catch them in the act of doing things they shouldn't, 20%. So interesting. There's always an element of that, or often an element of that. To maintain a presence of management in the workplace, 20%. To validate that what we believe is supposed to happen does actually happen, 90%. So by far, that's the most popular answer. And so that we know we've prepared as best we can for internal or external audits, 40%. So it's definitely part of the process for them. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, no, thank you for those. That's great. So yes, I think in terms of option one, I would say part of it can certainly assist with that, absolutely, especially safety, but as well as other regulatory requirements as well. So it's a great tool to support that, but I wouldn't regard it as being solely for that. And to check up on operators, to catch them in the act. Okay, it might serve to do that, but I wouldn't want you to be thinking that's its purpose. And I'm going to sort of come back onto that point actually and talk about a different mindset, a different way to think about it than just catching people out. To maintain the presence of management in the workplace. Well, again, it enables that, and that's exactly where management should be. By the way, spending as much time as possible in the Gemba, again, back out, rather than being stuck in meetings and conferences and so on. But actually spending time with the people who do the work. It all comes back to that thing about what are we learning about the way in which our business runs, or where mistakes are happening, and what are we doing about it collectively. So, but yeah, absolutely, to validate that we believe, so that what we believe is supposed to happen happens. I think that's probably the one I'd have gone with. And so we can be prepared again for internal audits. Again, it can support that, but I wouldn't want it to be solely regarded as that's what it's for.
I've also had another comment in the chat from Elena. Thank you, Elena. Which is also to make sure that the current process is still the best practice, which I think is absolutely key, isn't it, Damion?
Yeah, perfect. Absolutely spot on.
Thank you, everyone.
So the way I like to think about process confirmation and why you would want to do it is illustrated by this picture. This glass of ice, which has already started to melt, it's going to suffer from what we call entropy, which is a physics term that says that everything in nature has a natural tendency to become more disorganized and ordered. So everything will decay and sort of fall apart. And that's a bit of a morbid thought for a Friday afternoon. But if you put energy into that system, such as maintaining the temperature to be low, then you will maintain that structure that's been created, as in those ice crystals that have formed into those regular shapes. So I like to think of that as the analogy of the leadership and management's efforts of putting energy into their processes by doing something will help to maintain some of these structures that have been created. And what I mean by those structures is things like the standards that we've created or agreed upon, the mechanisms we've got in place that are supposed to help the process to run more smoothly. And if we don't put some energy into ensuring that the things that we thought were happening are is actually the way we operate, then we're not in touch. We're less in touch with reality, and therefore things can creep in and processes can suffer as a consequence. So that's the way I like to think about process confirmation. It's what are the aspects of our processes that we really ought to go and keep an eye on, not to catch people out and get them into trouble, but to genuinely go and convince ourselves that what we think is happening or should be happening is actually what's happening. So that's how I sort of position it in my mind. So what should we confirm and how should we do it? Well, in order for organizations to be successful, it says we need capable business processes And what we mean by business processes there is the processes of the work the operators do, the actual day-to-day running of the business. But we also need to have capable management processes as well, management systems. And both can be considered suitable for both standardization and process confirmation. So you as a manager who might not have anything to do with the business process, what you're doing is you're operating a management process. And the question is, how standardized is that? Or I should say those, because there's normally many of them. And what should you confirm to ensure that your management processes are also healthy and don't contain abnormalities? And people often miss that. They're always thinking about the business process, but maybe not so much the processes of management. So in terms of business processes, the sorts of things you might confirm could be these areas. You might look at performance and capability. As I've said, are we operating to the standards that we've created? So that could be both the written standards and the visual ones. Again, think of things like 5S. Think of the last S in 5S is sustain. If you want to know more about that, I did a webinar a few months ago about 5S. Are the inputs to meet the required standard or specification as we would expect, the things that we're coming into the process, the inputs. Capacity versus demand, do we have enough? Do we not have enough? What are we doing about that? Progress to plan, and so on and so on. They're fairly typical areas that you might be confirming various aspects of. But then when we come to, there you go, there's process workspace. When we come to the management systems, therefore we can think about, so how well are we solving problems? Do we do that root cause part, or are we just putting those containment actions in place and then moving on to the next problem? That would suggest that maybe our management processes aren't as effective as they perhaps ought to be. How do we respond to abnormalities, both in the actual steps we take, but also in terms of how we see them and think about them, how we regard them? Are people hiding them away because they're embarrassed, as opposed to celebrating their existence and taking the right steps to mitigate them coming back? How effectively are our communication efforts, and does it reach the staff? So, you might have a very senior manager that's done some sort of strategic update about the direction of the business. What's stopping them going and doing a confirmation with an operator or anyone else in the business and just saying, what did you understand from that brief I delivered in the previous week? Did you get, did those key messages we were trying to communicate, did they actually land? Did people get it? Or did it just confuse the hell out of them? So that's the benefit of process confirmation. Again, it comes back to, is what we thought happening actually happening, right? So it's almost like testing our theory in a way, if you think about it in terms of PDSA. Do we prioritize in the right way, and so on and so on. So where do the needs come from for confirmations? Well, it can be driven from lots of different areas. Safety requirements, customers, regulators, and so on. We've touched on a number of those. You can build the confirmations, again, to suit your specific requirements. And then in terms of how to go and confirm, so again, we say you should always go to the process. You should see it with your own eyes. You should always confirm against something like a documented standard, whether that be visual or written, rather than just having an opinion. And so, yeah, make sure that they're there. And use open questions to try and learn and explore things in more depth. And keep an open mindset. Don't just go out there and challenge people, but try and really understand, what are they facing into? What's it like for them? And then in terms of the behaviors, I think the main point on here, I'm just trying to wrap up because I've realized how long I've got. Make sure that process operators understand that this isn't about just checking up on them. You're not trying to catch them out, but it's better seen as the study part of PDSA. It's an opportunity for us to learn and grow together. And then very quickly, just the behaviors. When you're looking at the business processes, you're looking at the mindset of those people. Are they aware of the standards they're supposed to work to? Can they recognize abnormalities? Do they take the right sort of actions when one occurs? And if you're confirming the management processes, Again, you can be looking at things like, are we applying PDSA to the way we respond to things? Are we seeking input from operators about the sorts of questions they might want to ask? And then I've just got probably about 30 seconds left to do this. We've developed an app in PMI called Performance Genius. It's a digital way of doing confirmations. It feeds confirmation checks into a cloud that can be then displayed into a digital dashboard. Again, it works great if you've got teams who are spread out, and it's just a really, really fantastic way to consider using process confirmation, even if you've got people in many different locations. Sorry about rushing at the end there, but I'm aware that we've kind of hit the time. So, quick summary: visual management process confirmation is a way of presenting the right information to the right people at the right time, so they can take the right action to prevent problems, so that the outcome of processes is more aligned with exactly what your customers, stakeholders, and your business expects.
On behalf of SoftExpert, thank you for the presence of everyone who participated in this event. If you have any questions, please contact the presenter via email. To see other webinars, ebooks, and white papers on this subject, please visit our website at www.softexpert.com. Find out more about SoftExpert solutions for business compliance, innovation, and digital transformation. Thanks for listening. See you next time.